Look, I don't think I can hack the computers with my breasts, so it's all up to you and your brains.
You're gonna wear that? Why don't you just walk in there naked?
Don't be silly. I'd only be able to hide one gun if I were naked.
From the outside, it can be hard to pin down what kind of tone or style the two Fear Effect games for PlayStation 1 are going for. They're both rocking this eye-catching cel-shaded art style that lends nicely to the lighthearted, often comedic, banter-filled dialogue between its main characters. They lean heavily into the sex appeal of their main heroines sneaking around in skin-tight outfits, yet at the same time deal with horrific supernatural subject matter, accompanied by a ton of gore. The original Fear Effect was a game that was always in a drawer in my house growing up, so it kinda latched onto the back of my mind ever since. Nowadays, the games might be known best for the salacious advertisements that accompanied the second game's release. These definitely caught my eye while browsing through scans of old gaming magazines, but the fact that they were trying to sell a game with fear in the title never lined up for me. That's just how a lot of games were made and marketed back in the late 90s to early 2000s. And while the eroticism is there, the games are a sum of their parts, and what's really gonna sell you on them are their intense shootouts, challenging puzzles, and unrelenting brutality. Now, gaming is filled with franchises that died way too early, and Fear Effect is no exception. This one stings a little bit more because of just how close it was to getting a sequel on the PlayStation 2 by its original developers, before they had to shut their doors. In this video, I just want to focus on these first two games since they were released in such close proximity and fit together so well. In a follow-up, we'll do a deep dive into what could have been with the cancelled sequel, Fear Effect Inferno, after I've gotten some of you on board with why these deserve to continue. Set in a futuristic Hong Kong, the series follows a group of morally ambiguous mercenaries and their various exploits. This involves a ton of espionage, thievery, and murder, which the characters divvy out generously. In the original game, our heroes learn about the daughter of a powerful crime boss running away from home, and they concoct a scheme to locate her, not to help return her, but to ransom her off to her father for a major payday. Things quickly spiral out of control from there, as the reason for why she ran away comes to light, and our heroes go from battling the Triad to the Undead. Hannah, Glass, and Deke are the three playable characters that are consistent across both games. You could say Hannah is the main character since she gets more focus within the narrative itself. She was an orphan and prostitute who managed to escape that life and turned to freelance covert ops to get by. Glass is a no-nonsense military veteran who now uses his expertise as a hitman to net himself enough money to stay afloat. Deke is a foul-mouthed and unhinged Australian who will kill anyone in his way with a grin on his face. A fourth main character named Rain was added in the second game, Fear Effect 2 Retro Helix, which is actually a prequel to the first. She's an extremely intelligent and beautiful hacker who serves a support role and as a love interest for Hannah. Together, the two of them infiltrate a laboratory through the aqueducts in hopes of stealing a sample of DNA for a huge reward. Of course, this comes along with plenty of wonderful spy thriller style wardrobe changes and narrow escapes. But the plot really escalates into something much crazier in the second half in a way I don't plan on giving away. One of the most compelling prospects of the third game would have been seeing how Rain and her relationship with Hannah would have integrated with the rest of the crew, since it would have been a direct sequel to the first one. Beyond their sci-fi cityscapes and laboratories, the games bring in elements of Chinese mythology for their areas, puzzles, and enemy designs. This creates an interesting contrast, and they approach these elements with an art design and sense of personality that makes them feel distinct and original. That cel-shaded direction really helps these games hold up nicely, but even beyond that, it's the specific look to the facial animations which are intentionally low frame rate that I find the most appealing for some reason. These games manage to find a fantastic balance between the artistic sensibilities of Western animation and the anime that was becoming increasingly popular at the time. Both games are essentially standalone, but the experience of the prequel is enhanced when you know what the standard character relationships are and how they're foreshadowing things. Mechanically, they're extremely similar to one another, and I don't see that as a negative. I actually enjoy enjoy it when a series gets 2 entries in the same generation and the whole thing feels like a 2-parter. You can hop right into the sequel, translating all of your skills into this new story, where everything's familiar enough, but you're experiencing new locations and encounters. Throughout the games, you'll be switching perspectives at predetermined moments as you make your way from scene to scene in the narrative. And each character has their own inventory with a unique loadout of weapons. You shouldn't always go guns blazing, because like a survival horror game, you'll need to conserve your ammo to make it through key moments where hordes of demons are coming at you. Otherwise, you might find yourself losing a ton of progress and repeatedly dying to the same group of enemies. The game has set locations where you can save, but they're actually invisible. As you're walking around, you might hear a ringing noise, and I believe that's supposed to be your cell phone getting reception, meaning you can save. It's possible for you to miss some of these if you aren't exploring, but I felt like I developed the ability to sense where these were gonna be after a while. Stealth should always be your first option, and this is a surprisingly smooth process. You always know when you're targeting someone based on the green reticle at the top of the screen, and when you're sneaking up on an enemy from behind and that reticle turns red, you know you can get an insta-kill on them. Your characters are very agile. Not only do you have buttons for running and sneaking, but you have one for quick turning and another for dodging. So every shoulder button augments your movement in some way. You can dodge in any direction, and it's smart to sprinkle these into combat to avoid having your life drained. Dodging is especially useful when you're being chased down by someone using melee attacks. There's no stopping to shoot in this game, and you can run and gun to your heart's content, resulting in some really exciting room clearings. The title Fear Effect is meant to refer to your health bar, which pulses from green to red depending on how close you are to death. The unique element comes from the fact that there are no health items. Instead, your character's nerves are calmed by reaching certain points of the level, solving puzzles, or by killing enemies. It can add to the tension not knowing when you'll be able to get your health back. And in that same vein, it's possible to make things harder for yourself by saving while you're low on health, anticipating a health restore, but instead getting an enemy encounter which will continuously kill you until you can get through it flawlessly. The title Fear Effect is great, but I think we're giving this feature a little too much credit if we're naming the game after it. Compare this to a game like Illbleed, where your character's stamina, blood loss, and heart rate are all represented, and can each kill you in their own way. You can die from taking too much damage, but damage will also lead to more blood loss, which will kill you the more you move around without treating it. And even remaining in combat around enemies for too long can raise your heart rate and give you a heart attack. Now that's a game that's truly based around the effect of fear. Not that I'd want Fear Effect to present these concepts in such a literal way, but I beat both games on hard without even realizing this was what they were going for with the health system. I definitely noticed my health would be restored after completing certain chunks of the level, but I just thought the challenge was to see whether you could beat areas in a certain amount of hits. Speaking of beating the games on hard, if you're gonna play these, I suggest you go for all of the different endings. And getting to the end of the first game on hard will let you select a secret third option when the time comes. Hard mode doesn't really feel much more difficult until the final disc when enemies start ramping up, since a ton of hazards are insta-kills if you fail to make it through them, regardless of your difficulty setting. The second game does have multiple endings too, but nothing tied to your difficulty. Instead, there's a pretty interesting morality judgment the game passively makes early on based on your actions that can come back to bite you near the end, giving you an alternate cutscene and additional encounter which can make things harder for you. These games were developed by Kronos Digital Entertainment but published by Eidos, and I do think they fit nicely with the same direction they were taking the Tomb Raider series early on. In the second game, Hannah is even exploring ancient ruins while rocking a jacket similar to the one Lara Croft has in Tomb Raider 2. They were both definitely using the same sex sells strategy, but that was pretty typical for a lot of games in the late 90s to early 2000s. If you were to ask them, I'm sure their justification would sound pretty close to the way it was put by Ninja Gaiden and Dead or Alive director Tomonobu Itagaki.
I'm creating entertainment rather than just a video game. So in terms of entertainment, it's quite natural for me to create beautiful women. It makes sense rather than bringing ugly women into the game. It's very simple. Naturally.
The second game ramps this aspect up with the banter and interactions between the female leads, but it's definitely still an element of the first, where you'll be running around in a towel, dual-wielding pistols, or dressed up in a skimpy outfit to sneak through a brothel. The real question is whether these elements detract from the horror side of things or enhance them by making them even more surprising. Are you more invested in the survival of a character if you're attracted to them? And does your character feel more vulnerable if they're literally more exposed? I think these aspects are fun when the tone is lighthearted, but they're pushed out of my mind when the horror is ramped up and taken seriously. One of the most significant aspects of the game's presentation is its use of full-motion video loops for its pre-rendered backgrounds instead of the still images used in similar games. All of these environments are a series of fixed camera angles, but they're able to convey a greater sense of atmosphere with all of these moving details. You might see traffic going by down below you or gears turning around you. It adds an immersive element to the world, and of course, the real-time rendered models will blend in more naturally when viewed on a CRT as intended. They do some really cool stuff with this concept, even blurring the line between pre-rendered and real-time rendered elements. For example, Hannah is pre-rendered for the first part of the transition as she jumps in and out of this small room. Sometimes allies or bosses will be pre-rendered into the scene, since there's no reason for them to be rendered in real time. There's a really smooth transition at the start of the second game where the camera pulls out into the default view you'll be playing from. The whole time, Hannah is rendered in real time, so the transition to gameplay feels natural. But Rain is part of the background as she runs off camera ahead of you. Pre-rendered camera movements are surprisingly common, and oftentimes you'll be able to play freely while they're happening. Many obstacles in these games are trial and error by nature, where you'll try one thing and die, then try another thing and die again. In most cases, you'll get a unique death animation for each sequence you fail. It's a bit morbid, but part of the fun is seeing how many ways you can see yourself get killed. Like how many deaths did they account for with their own cutscenes that they went out of their way to animate. Just like in Tomb Raider, Hannah can die by getting turned into gold. These scenes, along with the animated backgrounds, are a double-edged sword, because space is a limited resource on a CD-ROM. Each additional frame of these backgrounds, an optional pre-rendered cutscene you might not ever see, adds towards the 660 megabyte capacity of the disc, which in turn limits the amount of story content and areas that can exist together at one time before you need to swap discs. The thing that dates these games the most is how much they had to compress all of these FMVs so that all of them could fit. Again, you wouldn't notice these as much on a television of the time, but I wish they could have been a bit cleaner when viewed through modern means. Both games come on 4 discs each, and when you switch to the next one, you'll be jumping to the next major area. Now, I do think they strike a good balance, and I never felt like I was getting shortchanged with the amount of playable material that was on offer. Compare that with a game like D for the same console, where the entire thing is pre-rendered. So the whole game ends up being 90 minutes across 3 discs, which only last 30 minutes each. Fear Effect extends playtime with some really challenging puzzles that keep you in one location for a lot longer. Many of these can feel really obtuse at first, but you'll smack your forehead once you realize what the logic is behind them and how the hints come together. The first game is really well paced from disc to disc, with a descent into madness as the horror elements are progressively amplified. Retro Helix is a bit messier in this regard, with a lot more swapping back and forth, but its areas are still great. Unlike the first one, it starts with horror, then oscillates tonally, getting much more lighthearted at times. Now, even extending into the next generation of consoles, we had some really great games that used animated, pre-rendered backgrounds. That's another reason why it's so unfortunate its PlayStation 2 sequel, Inferno, never got released. With the capacity offered by a DVD-based console, the issue of such noticeable compression and disc swapping would have been solved. The 2 games were directed and written by different people, and there's a noticeable shift in the authorial voice between projects. You might end up preferring the style of whichever one you end up playing first. Because while I do think the first game is much more inspired and focused, there's still a lot to love about the writing in the sequel. I look at it as another fun adventure in a series that was intended to have plenty more. The third game looked like it had the potential to balance out those 2 styles and really cement an identity for the series. But Eidos ended up declining on publishing Inferno after a significant amount of it was developed, and Kronos went out of business shortly after. Ever since then, the different companies who have passed around the rights to the franchise have had a hard time getting almost anything off the ground. At one point, it almost got to join the ranks of other legendary video game adaptations directed by Uwe Boll when he secured the movie rights. In 2018, a French independent developer known as Sushi was able to release a new entry called Fear Effect Sedna, by getting the series rights licensed to them by Square Enix. I haven't played it because I didn't really dig the art style they went with, which looks too much like that show Archer to me. I've noticed that when more modern games try to go for a cel-shaded look, it just comes out overly glossy. I haven't read anything too positive about the game, but I do respect them for going out of their way to make a sequel happen if they were longtime fans. This same team was also trying to make a remake of the original game called Fear Effect Reinvented. It was first shown off with a teaser that looked pretty promising, faithfully recreating all of the same fixed camera angles and everything. I'm not too interested in this type of remake where it's primarily a visual recreation using the same framework, but I understand it would appeal to a lot of new players. Unfortunately, they got replaced by another developer who reformatted the game into a standard cover shooter that looked like it could have been a PS3 era downloadable title. Then, the whole project got cancelled and we haven't had anything since. They need to stop messing around and give this series the high-budget sequel or reboot it deserves. And while they're at it, expand on the mechanics that these games get their name from, by adding more nuance to the way our health is affected by the tense situations we're placed in. Hopefully I've been able to shed some light on what these games are made of and what makes them so appealing, so that more people try them out, making a true revival more feasible. This series has such a versatile premise with so much untapped potential, whether we're talking about its spy, cyberpunk, or horror aspects, and its wild cast of characters could easily be expanded upon. There's more going on here than those magazine ads would have led you to believe. Its art style is striking, its universe is engrossing, and it blends action and stealth in a really smooth way. Your reflexes and intellect are sure to be challenged throughout both entries, but you'll always feel driven to make it to the next scene. After you check them out, look out for the follow-up to this video where I go over the playable beta for the cancelled third game, Fear Effect Inferno. That way, you'll really be able to appreciate how they were attempting to elevate certain mechanics moving into the next generation.
The camera?
Sorry, boys. This is private.